This is a video in a series of videos I'm making for a class I teach at ASU, PHI 328, History of Ancient Philosophy. Here we are at the syllabus. Let's go down to the lecture notes. Okay, and we had been thinking about Aristotle, and now we're going to turn our attention to the Hellenistic philosophers. The Hellenistic philosophers they belong to the so-called Hellenistic age. This is a time from roughly the death of Alexander the Great in 323 to the end of the Roman Republic in 27 BCE. Now, during this time, Aristotle and his school, they fall into the background. Plato's Academy changes its focus. It returns to trying to rehabilitate the Socratic point of view with its focus on the attempt to expose the pretense to knowledge. And um, two new schools emerged during this time. There are the Epicureans and also the Stoics. So you have Epicurus, his school, the garden, and then you have Zeno and the Stoics. Today's video is going to be about Zeno and the Stoics. Now, first, I guess we need a little bit of background here about the Hellenistic age. The term Hellenistic comes from the fact that during this time, large parts of the ancient world had become Hellenized, made Greek by the conquests of Alexander the Great. And this phenomenon is not, in a way, significant for the history of philosophy, but it makes sense to treat the philosophers and schools that lived during the Hellenistic age as a group, because there was something that united them. They were united in their critical reaction to the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, the philosophy that comes before them. So, for example, Epicurus, he reaches back, or at least tries to reach back across Plato and Aristotle to his understanding of what the 5th century atomists were after, Democritus and Leucippus. And the academics, that's what we call the philosophers in Plato's school during this time. The academics, they looked back to Socrates. As I mentioned, they're trying to rehabilitate his attempt to expose the pretense to knowledge, as opposed to developing the kinds of theories we saw in Plato, the theory of recollection, the tripartite theory of the soul, all these theories that we saw, the last one being the theory in the Timaeus. The academics during this time went back to what they thought of as the perspective in Socrates. And the Stoics did too, but they saw different things. They saw a different Socrates than the academics saw. They saw a Socrates that thought that knowledge was possible, and they tried to develop this perspective on Socrates in a way that avoided what they understood as the mistakes that Plato made and that Aristotle followed. And the first one that we can see clearly is the tripartite theory. So the Stoics don't think the soul has 3 parts. Remember, in the picture that we have from Plato, it looks like in the Protagoras, we have the historical Socrates view that the soul is reason, and that desires are beliefs of a certain kind. We called that Socratic intellectualism. But later in the Republic, Plato seems to turn his back on this view and to think that Socrates was wrong, and that in fact the soul has three parts, and their reason is just one of them. Well, the Stoics think this is a mistake and that Socrates was right, and they try to get at what they understand Socrates as thinking. Okay. Now, the tripartite theory of the soul, we saw it in two versions. We saw Plato's, and then we saw Aristotle's. They're a lot alike, but one way in which they're different is that Aristotle thinks human beings aren't born with reason, but they develop it over time in a natural process as they become adults. And the Stoics followed Aristotle on this particular point. They thought that children do not have reason, that human beings get reason only when they become adults, and they get it in a natural process that's a lot like the one that Aristotle described. But what happens when they get reason, according to the Stoics, is that the non-rational soul they had before is completely transformed, and the soul that they have once they become adults is reason and has no non-rational parts. This is different from the picture that we had in Aristotle. Remember that in Aristotle, we get reason and it comes to exist alongside the non-rational parts of the soul that we have when we're born. And so the soul in the adult is tripartite. Reason is just one of the parts. Where in the Stoics, we start out with non-rational souls, but once we become adults, our souls are completely reason in the way that Socrates thought. So like Socrates, the Stoics, they're intellectualists about desire. They are going to think that desires are really beliefs about what's good and bad. And now the Stoics, they developed this theory, this kind of idea that the soul is reason in a much more complicated way than anything we saw in Socrates. They think, first of all, that we get what they called impressions. An impression, as Diogenes puts it here, is an imprint on the soul. So the idea is that things in the world can impress themselves upon us. And an impression for the Stoics is roughly what we mean when we say things like, I have the impression that such and such is true. So for example, I have the impression that I'm looking at a computer screen. And these impressions, they're not restricted to sensory impressions. They also arise in thinking, and we could have impressions about what the future might be. And in general, we get impressions of features of the world. And both animals, children, and adults get impressions. But in animals and children, according to the Stoics, and there's once they get the impression, then it issues, if it's in a kind of action, if it's the right kind of impression. And so they have what they call impulsive impressions, right? So in animals, if they get the impression that they're hungry, then that impression leads to an impulse in them. It leads them to set off looking for food. And this happens in a kind of automatic way. Nature constructs, according to the Stoics, nature constructs animals this way so that when they get certain kinds of impressions, they do certain kinds of things. And nature has arranged it, according to the Stoics, so the things they do are in general beneficial for them. So, right, when they're hungry, they try to find food. And the same is true for children, right? They act in terms of their impressions, and it's a kind of automatic process. But in adults, according to the Stoics, the process is a little bit more complicated because adults, according to the Stoics, have reason. Now, merely having an impulsive impression is not enough to issue in an impulse. Adults have to assent to their impressions for them to result in action. And when you assent, you are exercising a part of reason. Reason is a power, assent is a power of reason. And so we, as adults, have reason, and we have to use reason in order to act because we have to assent to our impulsive impressions. And the Stoics thought, following Socrates, that what we do is a matter of, as adults, of what we believe is good and bad. And so our impulsive impressions are impulsive against the background of our beliefs about what's good and bad. And so we can get an idea, I think, of what the Stoics are thinking if we just consider an example. So suppose that someone, it's me in this case, right? I have a little garden. And sometimes in the winter, not very often in Phoenix, but sometimes in the winter, it threatens to freeze overnight. And I worry that the overnight temperature is going to kill my tomato plants. And so when I get this impression, it's impulsive for me because I have a certain belief, namely that the death of my plants is bad. And so and this impulsive impression leads me to try to do what I can to prevent the overnight cold from killing my plants. Now, someone else could also have the impression that the plunge in overnight temperature is going to kill my tomato plants. But if he doesn't care anything about my plants, doesn't believe that killing them is bad, he's not going to, this impression is not going to be impulsive for him. So which impressions are impulsive, according to the Stoics, is going to depend on your beliefs about what's good and bad. So I think we can see here that this is a very Socratic way of thinking, right? It makes our lives dependent on knowing what's good and what's bad, and all our actions are dependent on this. There's no non-rational part of the soul to overcome us, right? There's just our beliefs about what's good and bad, and these are the sources of our motivation, according to the Stoics. Now, these beliefs, right, about what's good and what's bad for the Stoics, like also for Socrates, they aren't the ones we might first expect, right? So Socrates, he puts wisdom at the center of his life. He thinks it's the most valuable thing. And he doesn't pay attention to the usual things that people think are good or bad, right? He's not concerned with his appearance and lives a very simple aesthetic lifestyle and so on. And the Stoics take this idea very seriously. They think that what is good is not, for example, your health, our health, but it's that nature is somehow completely and perfectly wise, and that what happens in nature is completely and perfectly rational, right? It's this that they think has the utmost value, and this will have implications for the life they think that's better than any others, right? So we can get some understanding of this if we contrast the fool, the person that the Stoics think of as a fool, with the person the Stoics think of as a sage, someone who's wise. The fool for the Stoics is the ordinary person, you and me. We're all fools from the Stoic point of view because we all have false beliefs about what's good and bad. We all believe, or at least the vast majority of us believe, that when we're sick, that's bad, and that recovering from an illness is good, that being hungry is bad, that not being hungry is good, and that pain is bad, that pleasure is good. We all have these ordinary beliefs, but from the Stoic point of view, they're all false. And having these beliefs makes us fools and makes us live a kind of life that the Stoics thought was um, not very happy, not very good. And we can, I think, um, see this if we look at an example, right? Suppose that um, suppose that I get sick and that I have ordinary beliefs about this, so I think this is bad, and it bothers me when I'm sick. And so when I, start to notice in myself the symptoms of a cold, I I get the impression that I'm getting a cold is impulsive for me. I try to take the steps I can to minimize the cold, right? To try to make it as short as possible and try to make it, if I have to endure the cold, try to make it as pleasant as I can. Now, suppose that it's not a cold, but that it's something much more serious, and I start to notice this over time. And it looks like it could be life-threatening, right? I'm going to the doctor, and the doctor's, telling me that, well, it looks like it could be this. This is not good. And now, right, even more worried and upset about the whole matter, right? I think this might be something that's going to threaten my life. I have the ordinary belief that my life is good and that my death is bad. And so now I have an impulsive impression to, right, take steps to prevent myself from dying, right? I run around going to the doctor, and the whole thing is very upsetting. And suppose over time, I get more and more information that shows me that I'm not going to beat this thing and that in fact I'm going to die. Now, right, I'm extremely upset, right, because I'm going to get something I think is bad, right? I'm in this series of events, right? One thing after the other has happened, and each time, right, instead of getting what I think is good, I am ending up getting what I think is bad, and this is making me miserable. And the Stoics think that um, this is maybe a drastic example, but that the life of the fool is like this, right? It's full of these kinds of miseries where things don't go your way, right? You're not getting what you think of as good, and you are getting what you think of as bad, and this is making you miserable on a daily basis, right? Sometimes things go your way, but for the most part, the world's not very cooperative. Uh, there's a lot of things we think are good that we end up not getting. And there's a lot of things that are bad that we wished we wouldn't get, but we end up getting. Now, the sage, from the Stoic point of view, lives a much more satisfying life because the sage doesn't have what the Stoics think of as false beliefs about what's good and bad, right? Stoic the Stoic sage thinks that what's good is the rationality in nature. Remember, from the Stoic point of view, um, nature unfolds in a perfectly rational way. there's no craftsman like there is in Plato's Timaeus that constructs the world so that it works the way it does. But nevertheless, they think that the nature does unfold in a perfectly rational way, and that this is really of the utmost value. And so when you go back to the sickness example, when I get sick, if I'm a sage, if I'm a Stoic sage, I don't think getting sick is bad, and that recovering from my sickness is good. But I do think, right, that in general, in a rational world, in general, uh, people who become sick do, especially from colds, right, do tend to recover. And so I'm not omniscient. I don't know what nature has in store for me, but it's rational for me, given this belief, to take the ordinary steps to, get rid of the cold and to regain my health. But so uh, I have an impulsive impression that leads me to certain kinds of actions, but it doesn't make me, right, anxious for my self. It doesn't make me worry that this cold is bad and that it's going to take a long time to recover. I don't have these beliefs about what's good and bad. I think that what's good is that the rationality in which nature unfolds. Now, suppose that I see, as in the case before, right, I start to see that's more than a cold. And I go to the doctor and I find out that. And now, right, if I were a fool, I would be even more upset. But this doesn't upset the sage because, again, right, he doesn't know what the future brings, but he thinks in general, right, if you get a cold, you recover. And that a lot of people, can recover from even more serious illnesses. And so he doesn't know what nature intends for him in this particular case, but it's reasonable for him to take steps to, right, beat the thing that's causing his sickness. And so he takes the usual steps anyone else would take, but he does it without the kind of worry and anxiety. Right? He doesn't think to himself that if it doesn't, right, if he doesn't recover from his illness, a very bad thing has befallen him. He doesn't have this belief about what's good and bad. And in fact, if he sees that he's not going to recover, and he's going to die, then again, he's not upset, because then it turned out that the rationality in nature didn't include him recovering from this particular illness. And that since what he values is the rationality in nature, he's not upset about his impending death. And just like Um, we said before that the case, is kind of extreme, but the Stoics think that this really is we can make a general point that the sage, right, his life is just continually one of complete satisfaction, because he doesn't have false beliefs about what's good and bad. And so his life, according to the Stoics, is better than any other life, because any other life is the life of a fool. Now, the Stoics think that Socrates had this sort of view, and we can see it if we look back to the portrayal in the Phaedo. So remember, the Phaedo is the fourth dialogue in the tetralogy. It's devoted to important events in the historical Socrates' life. In the Phaedo, we have his last day, when, remember, he's in jail, having been convicted, and he's awaiting a death sentence. And the Phaedo it takes place on the day in which he knows that death sentence is going to be administered later in the afternoon. And his friends come and talk with him on this last day. And here we have a passage from early in the Phaedo. The character Phaedo himself is talking. And the way the Phaedo works is that Phaedo has was there on Socrates' last day. He's returning home, and he runs into somebody who hasn't heard about what happened and is asking for a full report of the conversation that took place on Socrates' last day. And Phaedo gives it. So here we're early on, and he's saying to himself, um, he's saying to his interlocutor how he felt at the situation. And he says, I was not filled with pity as I might naturally be when present at the death of a friend, since he seemed so happy, eudaimon, right? So Socrates is not upset in the face of his death. And later, toward the end of the dialogue, when he is drinking the poison, all his friends are falling apart, right? They're having trouble uh, um, restraining their tears, holding back their tears, and they're very distressed because they believe, falsely from the Stoic point of view, that Socrates' death is a bad thing, and they see it's coming. But Socrates, right, he's not, right? He says, talks about that everyone was full of grief and breaking down except Socrates himself, right? And so the Stoics are thinking with their view that they're developing the position of the historical Socrates.